The crystal chandelier above the dining table threw sharp, cold light across the polished mahogany. Laughter and the clink of champagne glasses filled the air, but not the warm kind of laughter. It was the brittle, biting kind, the kind that made your stomach twist. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where are you from and from which city you're watching our videos. And after watching the whole video, don't forget to tell us, what would you do in this situation? Be honest. Tell me in the comments below. We read every comment. Let's begin. I sat at the far end of the long table, fingers wrapped around the stem of my untouched glass, forcing my expression into something neutral. If I reacted too soon, I'd give them the satisfaction. She has no education, no job, and no class. My Uncle Robert's voice cut through the noise, sharp as broken glass. He was standing now, one hand gripping his champagne, the other gesturing at me like I was an exhibit in a courtroom. She's a failure. The laughter from my cousins and a few aunts rippled down the table. Some of them tried to hide their smirks behind their glasses. Others didn't bother. I kept my eyes steady, breathing slow. The old me would have broken down, maybe even left the room. But the woman sitting here tonight wasn't the same one they thought they knew. Robert took a slow sip of his drink, savoring the humiliation he thought he was serving. You know, he continued, looking toward my husband Ethan at the opposite end of the table, you could have done better. Marrying her? I mean, what was the plan? Pity project? A hush fell for a second, not out of discomfort for me, but because the insult was direct now. My husband set his glass down with a quiet, deliberate click. His chair scraped the hardwood as he stood. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Conversations died instantly. Ethan's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Robert, he said, looking directly at my uncle without flinching, you might want to be careful about the things you say tonight. Robert smirked, clearly expecting a weak defense. Oh? And why's that? Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a folded document. His movements were unhurried, controlled, every second making Robert's confidence falter. Because while you were busy making toasts and counting imaginary wins, Ethan said, his voice carrying over the silent room, my wife was making moves. He unfolded the paper and set it down on the table in front of Robert. She just bought out your company this morning. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint ticking of the antique wall clock. Robert blinked, looking between Ethan and me like he'd misheard. His fingers fumbled for the paper. He skimmed the first few lines and his face lost all color. His hand trembled just enough for me to notice. I didn't move. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any speech I could have given. The other relatives were frozen, forks midway to mouths, champagne glasses hovering in the air. No one dared make a sound. Finally, Robert set the paper down and laughed, but it wasn't his usual booming laugh. It was sharp, forced, and laced with panic. This is a joke. Ethan didn't blink. No joke. The ink's still fresh. As of 10 a.m. this morning, we own your company outright. Every building, every asset, every employee, they answer to her now. He tilted his head toward me. So maybe think twice before calling her a failure. Robert's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked around, maybe hoping someone would laugh with him, break the tension. No one did. I finally spoke, my voice calm but clear. You're right, Robert. I don't have a degree. I don't have a 9-to-5. But I do have something you'll never have, control over your future. And tonight, you're sitting in my seat at this table. He swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw fear replace that smug arrogance. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. Drink up, I said softly, my eyes locked on his. It's going to be a long night. Robert's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous, uneven rhythm. The sound was almost drowned out by the faint clinking of cutlery as a few relatives tried to pretend they were still enjoying dinner, but no one was actually eating. All eyes kept darting between him, me, and Ethan. You think this changes anything? Robert's voice was quieter now, but there was an edge to it, a desperate attempt to keep some ground. You have no idea how that business works. You'll tank it in a month. Ethan didn't even bother to respond. Instead, he lowered himself back into his seat with a calm, deliberate ease that screamed, I've already won. I leaned forward just slightly, resting my elbows on the table. Funny, I said, my voice low enough that the room had to go quiet to hear me. because the board of directors didn't seem to think so. In fact, they seemed relieved. Robert's jaw tensed. His wife Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside him, her eyes darting between us. She knew more than she wanted to admit. Relieved? Robert scoffed. They've worked with me for decades. I smiled without warmth. Yes. And in those decades, you've run profits into the ground, turned away investors, and alienated half your executive team. All they needed was someone with the resources and the will to make a move. And you handed me both when you underestimated me. A few gasps traveled down the table. My cousin Laura muttered something under her breath, earning a sharp elbow from her mother. Melissa tried to interject, her voice sweet but tight. This is a family dinner. Maybe we shouldn't— No, I cut her off. We should, because for years, Robert's been making these dinners his little stage. Every chance he got, he'd remind me where I stood, or where he thought I stood. He loved painting me as some helpless woman who married into money because I had nothing else going for me. My uncle's nostrils flared, but he stayed silent. And now, I continued, the only thing you'll have going for you is whether I decide to keep you in that company or cut you out entirely. The color drained further from his face. He glanced toward Ethan, but my husband was simply sipping his wine, watching him like a chess player observing a cornered opponent. I could sue, Robert finally said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Ethan set his glass down gently. You could, he said evenly, but you'd lose. Everything was clean. Your shareholders approved the sale, and given the debt you've stacked up, you should probably thank us for not letting the banks eat you alive first. It was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My uncle, the man who'd spent years controlling the tone of every family gathering, suddenly had nothing. I turned to my left and caught my cousin Greg staring at me with wide eyes. He wasn't smirking anymore. Neither was Laura. The balance in the room had shifted, and I could feel the weight of that shift pressing against Robert's shoulders. I leaned back in my chair, my voice calm. You spent years making sure I knew my place. Tonight you learned I don't take the seat you give me. I take the head of the table. The words hung there, unchallenged, as Robert lowered his gaze to the tablecloth. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Men like Robert didn't just fold. They looked for ways to claw their way back, and I could see it in his eyes. The real fight was still coming. Robert's fork scraped against his plate, loud and grating. The fake composure he'd been trying to hold onto was slipping fast. His eyes, once so smug, were scanning the table, searching for allies. I wouldn't be so sure you've won, he said finally, his voice low but dripping with venom. Money doesn't buy respect, and when people find out how you got the money to pull this little stunt, he let the sentence trail off, smirking as if he'd just tossed a grenade. A ripple of tension moved through the room. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hand lightly brushing his arm, silently begging him to stop. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. Careful, Robert. No, Robert said, holding up a hand as if to claim innocence. I'm just saying, maybe the rest of the family doesn't know everything about your wife's past. I stared at him, my expression still calm. Though my pulse was picking up, he was fishing, trying to make me flinch. Enlighten them, I said flatly. The smirk faltered for a moment, just enough to show I'd hit the nerve first. You really want me to? I tilted my head slightly, my voice smooth. I've got nothing to hide, Robert, but I can't say the same for you. Should we talk about the off-the-books bonuses you funneled to certain consultants? The room went still. Melissa's hand froze midair. Across from me, my Aunt Shirley shifted in her chair, eyes darting nervously to Robert. Robert's lips parted, then shut again. For a second, he seemed to weigh whether pushing forward was worth the risk, but his pride was too big. That was business, he snapped. Not dirty laundry for dinner conversation. Oh, so my life is fair game at your table, but yours is off limits? I asked, my voice soft but edged like glass. A faint, awkward laugh came from Laura, who instantly regretted it when every pair of eyes turned her way. Ethan placed his hand lightly over mine under the table, grounding me without needing to say a word. I knew that look. He was letting me handle this my way. I leaned forward just enough for my words to land sharp. You've been in that company so long, you think you are the company. But the truth is, Robert, you're replaceable. And as of this morning, you already have been. Robert's breathing was heavier now, his chest rising and falling faster. He gripped his champagne glass so tightly I half expected it to shatter. Finally, he set it down hard enough to make a few drops spill onto the tablecloth. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice shaking with something between anger and humiliation. "No," I said, standing now, my chair scraping back against the wood. "It's just beginning." The words hung there like a storm cloud. I didn't sit back down. Instead, I walked slowly around the table, every step echoing in the tense silence, and stopped right beside him. My hand rested lightly on the back of his chair as I leaned close enough for only him to hear. "I didn't buy your company to ruin you, Robert," I whispered. "I bought it because I know exactly how you've been running it, and how much damage you've done to people who didn't deserve it. I'm going to fix what you broke, and you can either work under me or watch from the outside as I do it without you." I straightened up, walked back to my seat, and lifted my glass. "To family," I said dryly, "always full of surprises." No one dared toast back. Robert didn't drink to my toast. He sat stiff in his chair, his hand curled into a fist against the tablecloth. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, trying to spin this disaster into a win. It didn't take long. He started leaning toward the relatives closest to him, speaking in low tones, eyes flicking in my direction between sentences. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Phrases like, "She doesn't know what she's doing," and "Ethan's pulling her strings." Classic Robert. If he couldn't win in the open, he'd try to poison the room from the shadows. Melissa was doing the same, though less subtly. She leaned over to my Aunt Shirley, whispering something that made Shirley's mouth tighten and her eyes narrow at me. I let them talk. Let them dig their own holes. Across the table, my cousin Greg cleared his throat loudly. "You know," he said, his voice carrying just enough to silence the whispers, "I've worked for Robert for 8 years, and I'm not saying I've seen everything, but—" He hesitated, glancing at me. "Let's just say I'm not surprised the board sold." Robert's head snapped toward him. "Greg, watch yourself." Greg shrugged, but his tone hardened. "No, I think I've watched enough. Watched you take credit for other people's work. Watched you throw junior staff under the bus to save your own skin. Watched you funnel money into side projects that conveniently involved your buddies." A stunned hush fell over the table. My heart kicked up, not from fear, but from the unexpected feeling of someone breaking rank. Robert's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "You ungrateful." Greg didn't flinch. "Ungrateful for what? The unpaid overtime? The constant threats about how I should be lucky to have a job?" Melissa tried to cut in, but Greg's voice rose over hers. "You want to talk about who's a failure? How about the man who just lost his company because he thought humiliating his own family was more important than running it, right?" I watched the room shift again. The people Robert thought were on his side suddenly weren't looking at him. They were looking at me, and some of them were actually nodding. Robert's breathing was ragged now, but he couldn't blow up here without confirming everything Greg had just said. His eyes darted to Ethan, but Ethan was just calmly observing, almost as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I set my glass down and spoke clearly, making sure everyone heard me. "I didn't buy the company for revenge. I bought it to save it. Because the truth is, Robert, you were about to lose it to the bank. And if you think I'm wrong, feel free to show everyone your last quarterly report." Robert's hand twitched, but he didn't move. Greg leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Guess some of us were just waiting for the right person to take the wheel." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. For a man who loved to dominate a room, watching him sit there, silent, cornered, and stripped of his usual swagger, was the sweetest proof that power had shifted for good. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't done yet. And I knew, before this night was over, he'd try one last desperate move. Robert's silence didn't last long. I could see the way his jaw worked, the faint twitch in his temple. This was a man who couldn't stand being cornered, who lived off controlling the narrative. Losing that control in front of his own family, it was eating him alive. The dining room felt heavier now. Even the air seemed thicker, charged with that electric tension before a storm breaks. And then, just as I expected, Robert made his move. He pushed his chair back sharply, the legs screeching across the polished floor. "You all think she's some hero," he spat, pointing a finger in my direction. "But let me tell you who she really is." Melissa's hand shot out to grab his arm, but he yanked it away. "She didn't earn that money. She didn't build anything. She married into it. She's nothing without Ethan. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, but Robert barreled on, feeding off his own anger. And now she's parading around like she's some corporate savior? Please. This is all a game to her. She'll run the company into the ground in 6 months. I let him talk. His voice was loud, almost frantic now, his words spilling over each other. He thought the volume would mask the desperation. When he finally paused for air, I stood slowly, my palms resting lightly on the table. Are you finished? My voice was low, but it cut through the room like a knife. Robert sneered. Not even close. I nodded once. Good, because now it's my turn. I walked around the table, not rushing, each step echoing in the silence. Every pair of eyes followed me until I stopped beside Robert. You've made your opinion of me very clear over the years, I said, my tone calm but sharpened by something colder. You've called me useless, weak, a mistake, and I took it. I let you say whatever you wanted because I knew something you didn't. I leaned in slightly. That every insult, every attempt to humiliate me, every time you tried to keep me in my place, was building the fire I'd need to take everything from you the day I decided I was done. His face was inches from mine, his nostrils flaring, but he didn't speak. I straightened, my voice rising so everyone could hear. You're right, Robert. I didn't have the money to buy your company on my own. But what you've never understood is that success isn't about doing it alone. It's about knowing who to trust, who to work with, and who to cut loose. And tonight, you just made the last one very easy for me. I pulled a second document from my bag and placed it in front of him. This is your termination letter, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. You can collect your personal items tomorrow, I continued. Security will escort you out. And before you threaten to sue again, this too was approved by the board. You've been voted out. Robert's hand hovered over the paper, but he didn't pick it up. His chest was rising and falling fast, his eyes darting around the table as if searching for someone to step in. No one did. Greg broke the silence with a low whistle. Guess that's checkmate. Robert's chair scraped as he stood, his hands clenched at his sides. For a second, I thought he might explode. But instead, he just muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the heavy front door slamming behind him. The sound echoed for a long moment before anyone spoke. Melissa slowly stood, her face pale. I should go after him. She gave me a quick glance, half fury, half fear, and followed him out. Ethan rose from his seat, walked over to me, and placed his hand on the small of my back. His voice was quiet enough for only me to hear. You handled that perfectly. I exhaled, realizing only then how tense my shoulders had been. As I looked around the table, I saw it, those subtle shifts in expression. People who had once seen me as the quiet outsider were now seeing me as something else entirely. Not a failure, not a pawn, a force. I picked up my glass, the bubbles catching the light, and raised it slightly. To new beginnings, I said. This time, every single glass lifted in return. And for the first time in years, I left a family dinner with my head high and my heart steady, knowing I'd finally taken back the power they never thought I'd have.